Chapter 11. Alice's Confession. When I woke the next morning, I heard Shadow at his litter. My mouth was dry, my head was thick, my bladder heavy with unaccustomed drink, but I waited until the sounds of his toileting had stopped. By the time I got to the bathroom, he had moved on. I closed the door behind me and took care of the essentials. Shadow was nibbling at his dry food when I entered the kitchen to put on the tea. Following our old habit, I scooped a handful of fresh kibble from the bag in the cupboard and put it in his dish, picking up the water dish in the same bend and refilling it. Usually Shadow barely moves his head aside as I do these chores. Today he backed away onto a rug I kept nearby and scraped his claws against it until I finished my business and moved away. Usually I give Shadow an affectionate stroke or two while he has his breakfast. The look in his eyes told me any touching would be most unwelcome now. I blinked some quick tears away and put on the tea. Always a comfort to me in times of trouble, Shadow was no help now. Usually, Shadow lies within a few feet of me. Now we found ways to be in different rooms, so neither would disturb the other. Usually, Shadow starts lobbying for dinner around 4 p.m. if I'm home. A charade of the hunt, I suppose. Now I served his dinner at 5 p.m., but when I went to bed, it was still untouched. During the long and mostly sleepless night, I heard the sound of his prowling around the flat, but that prowl never brought him into my room or onto the bed we'd shared for so long. I cried so often and so hard that morning, I must have lost 5 pounds. Obviously water weight. What the fuck else would it be? There is no reason to goddamn put that in there. By morning, it seemed to me that last night's dinner had been nibbled at, and I put down some fresh kibble and water. When I turned, Shadow was sitting very formally in the doorway to the dining room. His eyes narrowed and he dropped into a crouch, his tail lowered. I got out of the way as fast as I could. Just before lunch, the doorbell rang. By the time I got downstairs, the delivery truck was pulling away. 2 large boxes stood outside my door. A dozen pairs of jockeys in sleeveless tees in a silk linen blend, no less, and a dozen pair of boxers and short-sleeved tees in a cotton so fine it might have been silk. And tucked into an envelope taped to the box, a bill for $1,500, marked paid in full. Suddenly, I knew I couldn't take another day of this. I called Sally and told her I needed her right away. Usually when I leave the house, I find Shadow and say goodbye. Sometimes I even tell him where I'm going and how long I'll be away. I know it's silly, but that's how we were. Today I just grabbed my keys and coat and headed out. I arrived at Sally's therapy office to find the gate into the courtyard open. As if she had guessed, I would never remember the numerical code that opens the lock. She rented space in one of 3 cottages. There were windows out the front, but for privacy, Sally had built another wall about 4 feet from the windows, making 2 rooms. A sunny place where clients could wait and a windowless place where they could talk without being seen. Sally was standing in the doorway to the inner room when I came in. Without words, she drew me inside and put a cup of tea in my hand. I sank into the sofa, which was old and soft and seemed to reach up to cuddle me and keep me warm. I don't know where to start. You saw this Sam again, she said. I nodded. He came by the other night. We talked about our quarrel. We made up. We even slept together. Just sleep, nothing else. Yesterday, we went downtown shopping. He needed some things, and I offered to help. We had such a lovely day. That's nice. But I stopped on the way home at Walgreens. He started eyeing all the women, the young ones. It made me mad. And when we got home, we had a terrible fight. I was amazed at how adept I had become at talking about my relationship with the man of my dreams without including the key element. About what? About sex. He said I was too old and to be desirable. He said he would never have sex with me, that I didn't have to worry about that, as if I would. Sally slipped out of her chair and onto the couch beside me, hugging me while I cried. Geez, she said. Of all the things, I suppose it brings it all back. I knew she was thinking about my disastrous first and only marriage. David and I met at Stanford, where I was on scholarship and he wasn't. Beginning in sophomore year, we dated regularly. When the girls got into Sunday morning conversations about where their dates had put their hands or mouths or other body parts, I had almost nothing to share. But I wasn't complaining. I had been cursed with averageness. Not really fat, but not thin. Not really ugly, but not pretty. Not really poor, but not rich. The girl nobody notices. Except for a couple of high school dates arranged by friends, David was my first boyfriend. I was of a mind to be loyal. And just before graduation, David proposed, giving me a ring the size of a cherry, symbolizing my virginity, I suppose. We were married the following November, and on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, that meant we had to cut our honeymoon short to be home for his family's annual feast. But by Thursday, I was happy for their company. Since David was my first lover, I didn't understand at first how unusual our sexual relationship was. I only knew that it was clumsy and painful. After a while, he stopped trying to do it the usual way, and for the last few months of our marriage, we were pleasuring each other with our hands only. At least, this turned out to be pleasure. And so I was completely unprepared when I came home early one day to find him on the kitchen floor with the guy who had been our best friend, clearly having no erectile dysfunction. Worse still, David had barely zipped up his pants when he told me he wanted a divorce so he and Steve could get together. Steve. Couldn't have picked a more generic name. Okay. In the San Francisco of that time, being gay was not something one flaunted, at least not if one belonged to a family like David's family and had his expectations. He said he would be generous if I would be quiet. We both kept our promises. Maybe this Sam just meant he didn't want to have sex right then. Never was his word. I didn't make it up. Did he say why? Because I'm too old. It would break his rules, he said. She pulled away. It might be his problem, not yours, you know. I don't get it. A lot of middle-aged men have sexual issues, dysfunctions. You know they can't get it up, at least not long enough and hard enough to be useful. Maybe he was just covering up. Half of the middle-aged women I know complain that their men can't do it, and the other half, well, what? She squeezed my hand. For a lot of middle-aged women, sex just isn't interesting anymore. On the whole, they'd rather not participate, but that can make problems, especially for those in relationships where sex has always been a regular thing. They don't want sex, I said. I know that will seem strange to you. When I made the first painful steps towards resuming a social life after my marriage, I practically insisted on having sex with a man before I'd let him take me out. Over time, my behavior became more moderate, but I still thought sex should be a part of every relationship, and if the man was slow initiating it, I did. I like sex, I said, although that wasn't true of each and every encounter. Yes, she said, but her eyes didn't meet mine. I suppose it also confirms that there was nothing wrong with you just because David preferred guys. You're shrinking me. You're not supposed to do that. All right, so is it possible that this guy is just worried about not being able to meet your expectations? I shook my head. I don't think so. You think he's gay? I laughed. Have you ever heard of a gay cat? There was what seemed like an hour of silence while we both examined the metaphorical hairball I had just coughed up. Finally, I tried to explain. I told you Sam had some eccentric ideas. One of them is that he's a cat. My shadow, to be specific. Having sex with women who aren't in heat is against the rules in the cat world. You're serious. Her face was tight. I could see her jaw muscles working. Yeah, that's what he says. That's what he's been saying since the first time. That cat burglar, remember? He's the cat or the burglar or both. He says he's made himself look like the famous actor because I once said I thought he was handsome. This is all for me, he says. He believes this? Absolutely and without reservation. And what do you believe? I had never planned to confess this much, and I was determined not to confess the rest. I'll say this, I said. I've never seen Sam and Shadow in the same room at the same time, and I'm still not sure how Sam comes and goes. I smiled, because her face was looking more and more worried. But how could I believe something so preposterous? She remained silent. You're sure this is from him, and not something you imagined? I offered. She nodded. Then David's imagining him too, and various downtown merchants were falling all over themselves trying to please a man they thought was a movie star. She sighed. To tell the truth, I never thought you had much imagination. I'm not being critical. You have a lot of lovely qualities, but imagination? I don't think you have the ability to imagine such a thing. But this guy has to be delusional, and he could be dangerous. I don't think so, I said. He's really very sweet. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Shadow. Don't go there, not even for a minute, she said. Shadow is a cat. This other character is a very strange man, and I hope you'll stay away from him. I don't think he'll be back, I said. But you feel bad about that. A little. It's very romantic in a bizarre sort of way. He really plays a cat very well. He was rather enchanting and, of course, handsome, and he said he loved me. I started falling in love, and it felt nice. It's been a long time. Well, on occasion, romance can get you into a lot of trouble. It's not the same as love, Sally said. Romance is something you trip over and fall into. Love is more active than that. Take you and Shadow. You saw this ailing cat and decided on the spot to bring him home. Do you remember? Of course I remember, I said, with an ironic edge. He was scrawny and he'd lost half of his fur. And he had a chest infection that took weeks to cure, ear mites, God knows what else. But you grew to love him, Sally said. It was a choice, not a feeling. Do you see what I mean? You're saying I didn't fall in love with him. I learned to love him. Exactly. I think you decide to love someone, you pick someone out, and you work at making a relationship with him. I was married a year after I had that revelation. I sighed. I don't want to talk about not being married. After all, I gave it a try. Maybe. Certainly. David didn't, she said. But maybe you should think about trying again. I bristled. You think I would be better off married? I think you would be better off in a solid relationship. It might lack the excitement of your delusional friend, but it would have a chance of lasting. Will you try? Well, now wasn't everybody asking me to try something these days? And in the weeks that followed, everybody, it seemed, turned up with a friend I should go out with. Try it out, they said. Maybe you'll like him. A couple of the men were in their late 60s or early 70s. We went out to lunch or had an early dinner. We talked about their golf game and how easy it would be for me to learn to play. We watched movies on the DVD. We watched movies on the DVD, and half the time, they went to sleep before the movie ended. One was an attorney about my age. He reminded me of the man I call Ben. He was traveling all the time, and not always there even when he was home. We talked about his work and his kids and his ex-wife. He went to plays, but his beeper always vibrated before the first intermission, and I had a choice of leaving or staying by myself. Usually, I stayed. Another was a couple of years younger than me. He had made a fortune in the .com boom, and now he had time to spend it, but no idea how to do that. It was like dating one of my ex-clients. I planned all our dates. I picked the restaurants and ordered dinner. He did take me to his house once, a place that had been professionally decorated and had been undisturbed by a single personal touch. Everything was so neatly in place, it looked nailed down. We wanted to have sex, but I was afraid we'd rumple the sheets. On our last date, we went to the symphony. I caught him playing video games on his Palm Pilot during the second movement. That was it. You get the drift. I did try, but I didn't like any of them. It wasn't just that I felt no sparks, no sizzle. They were totally unappealing, boring, and self absorbed, or so needy and attentive that they felt like cookie dough stuck on your fingers. I couldn't just see how being married to any of them would make me any happier. And I thought about what Sally said too. I could see how part of my attraction to Sam had involved the unique situation. If it was implausible, it was also stimulating and fun. I remembered what she said about picking someone out and working at building a relationship. It made sense, but not with these guys.